Today's daf is daf Yud Aleph. I'm going to start on the top of the daf by quoting the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if he designates on Erev Yontif Gozlim, and it's Pesoch HaKain, and then Motzah Lifnei HaKain, so he finds that the Gozlim are no longer inside the coop, they're in front of the coop, Asurim, because we're afraid that this is not the same Gozlim that he had designated, and these are rather Gozlim that came from somewhere else. Le Misayeh le Rabbi Chanina. Our Mishnah should support Rabbi Chanina. The Omer Rabbi Chanina, Rov Bekarov Halach Achar Harov. So if you have a suffix, and you can tip the scale based on Rov, or perhaps you can come to a different conclusion based on Karov. And Rabbi Chanina paskins that the Rov is stronger than the Karov. In our Mishnah, we have a suffix if these Gozlim that he finds in front of the Kain, do they come from inside the Kain, which is called Karov, or do they come from Rov, meaning the Alma? Most of the birds that fly through the atmosphere of the earth, then we assume Halach Achar Rov Keneged HaKarov, and they came Mi Alma, and therefore the Mishnah paskins Asurim. These are not the Gozlim that he had designated for use on Yom Tov. Omer Abaye b'daf. Abaye says, no. You misunderstood. We're talking about a daf, which is a davar aboleit min hashovach. It's a luach eitz that juts out from the shovach, and the yonim that come from the world, they stand and congregate on that luach eitz, on that wooden platform. And now kurva doesn't play a role anymore. You're telling me that there are yonim inside the ken, and that's karov. No. It's possible that these yonim came to this place, to the daf, from the alma. That they're also krovim. I mean, the daf is accessible to any number, myriads of birds that are floating through the air. So therefore, we should be machriya. We should determine this suffix and assume that these yonim came from the alma, from Shire Alma, because those yonim that came from Alma have two pluses. They have two milas. Number one, they are karov to this daf, and number two, they are rov. But this would not prove and establish the din, the principle of Rabbi Chanina. And in a case of Rov and only Rov is stronger than Karov. Rava Amar, Rava offers an alternative rejection of the proof to Rabbi Chanina from our Mishnah. Vishnei kinim zo lemala mizoas kinam. We're talking in the Mishnah about a shovach that has two different coops in it. One is situated on top of the other. And what he did was he designated Gozlim from one of these two kinim and not from the other ken. And now when Yontif comes around, he finds the Gozlim lifnei ken shezimei mimenu. They're in front of the coop where he had designated his Gozlim. In the other ken, he doesn't find any Gozlim whatsoever. And therefore the Mishnah says they are asurim. And the explanation to that is pretty straightforward. This is not because we're afraid and we assume that they came from the Rov, the Alma, but rather, since clearly he doesn't locate the Gozlim that he had designated where he had left it, and he has Gozlim now that are muktzah in the other ken, which he doesn't find in their ken. Therefore, Choshesh, maybe the Gozlim in front of the ken didn't come from inside the ken, but rather from the second ken, which is now empty. So this is not a hachro. We're not deciding the suffix based on Rov. This has nothing to do with the principle of Rabbi Chanina and the power of Rov. And now Rov explains the chiddush of the Tana. Lo mi boy, the Tana didn't have to tell us that in a case of zimein b'tachtona, below Zimein Ba'elyona, he had designated the birds in the lower coop, not in the upper coop. Umotza b'tachtona, now he finds the birds in the tachtona, but in front of the cane of the tachton. He didn't find anything inside. V'lo matzah, so too he didn't find any gozlim b'alyona, not in front of it nor inside of it. Asirin, why? Tamrinan hanach ozlu yalma, the ones that he had designated may very well have flown the coop, as we say, they flew the coop, and these that he now finds in the tachtona are not the same ones that he was mizamen. Hanach ishtarbu v'nochus. Those in the Elyona, which he did not designate, now went down to the lower coop in front of the ken of the lower coop. And that's very typical of birds. They tend to fly out of the coop to the nearest lower coop. Ella, and the Tana wants to be mechadish, afilu, even in the case of Zimen Belyona, velo Zimen B'tachtona. He did not designate any birds in the lower coop. Uba umatza Belyona, velo matza B'tachtona. And now we have a problem because he doesn't find any of the birds in Tachtona, means they checked out. He finds birds in the Elyona, in front of the Ken Halyona. Is the Mishnah tells me Hanach Nami Asiri. Even in this case, it's awesome. And the gozim that he found in front of the Ken Halyona are Asurim, even though he was Mezamein the gozim, but those were inside the Elyona. And even though you could have said that it's not Derek Gozlin, these little young fledgling birds, to climb up from the Tachtona, the bottom, all the way to Elyona, and therefore those that he finds in front of the Elyona, Mistam, they came out of the Kain Halyona, and they should be Mutarm, because that's exactly what he designated. The Tana says no. Tamrinon Hanach Ozuli Alma. It's very possible that those gotzos that he had designated in the Elyona flew the coop. They're out there in the world, in the earth, flying through the globe. Fahanach, and these birds, Sruche, Sarach, Usliku. The birds in the Tachtona grabbed onto the walls of the Shovach, and they were able to climb from the bottom all the way on top to the place which is the platform in front of the Ken Halyona. And therefore the Gozlim that he found there are Asurim. Further, we learned in our Mishnah that if he finds Gozlim in front of the cave, V'im Ein Sham Elohim, at the time that he designated, there were no other coops around. There was no other can of Gozlim, in addition to or beyond the ones that he had designated for use on Yontiv, Hare Elu Mutarim. So therefore, for sure, we have no question that those that he finds in the Ken, which he designated, are the ones he designated, and therefore Mutarim. So the Gemara wants to say, hey, Chidami, what's the case? Ilaim b'mefarachim, we're in a kind of a mimanavshach situation. If we're talking about older, more mature birds, Gozlim, Golim, that can fly, then Ikal Meimar, we should really raise the possibility that Hanach Ozlu Alma, the ones that he had designated, flew out there to the world, they're flying through the air, through the stratosphere. Fahani Achrini Ninu. It's very possible the Gozlim that he had designated from yesterday went, they checked out, and those that he finds today in front of the king are different Gozlim. And the reason for this chashash is because since they're more mature birds and they can fly, let's assume they flew away. And even on Erev Yontif, although there were no other Gozlim around at that point, nevertheless, we should ask them. And the Gemara says, so what's your other option? To justify why he can rely that these are the same Gozlim that he designated them Mutarim, Ella, you're going to have to say b'madadadim, that these are young fledgling birds that do not have the capacity to fly. Says the Gemara, you know what? I'm not sure even in that case we can justify the Mishnah's psak that they're mutarim, and these are the ones he designated, because ika b'toch hamishim ama, if this cane and another cane nearby, a neighboring cane, which is within a circumference, a proximity of toch chamishim ama, idudei idadu, the birds can wobble back and forth for a distance of up to 50 amma. And therefore, once again, how do we know that the gozlim that he had set aside are the same that he finds? But on the other hand, if there's no other cane anywhere within the circumference, the proximity of 50 amma, then pshita demutarim. I don't need the Mishnah to tell me that these are mutarim. Diomar bar ukva bar chama, kol hamedade, eno medade yosem michamishim amma. So what was the Mishnah coming to mechadish? There are no other gozlim within close proximity. These are the ones, obviously, that he designated. So for sure they are mutarim. Gemara says, Li olam diika kain b'toch hamishim amma. There is another coop within a proximity of 50 amma. That other coop is situated in such a way that the gozlim, when they come out of that coop, will not be able to see the first coop, the coop which he designated. Why? Because they're in a Keren Zavis situation. So there's a blockage that doesn't allow them to see the full length of 50 amma. Mashmalon, ma'udetevi duye adadu, that you might think that the gozlim from the other Keren, the other cane, would be medaded into this cane where he was mazmin because it's within 50 amma. And therefore, we should prohibit those that are in this cane because of the suffix. He will only jump around back and forth on one leg and on another leg and waddle back and forth if he can still see, he has his eye set on the shovach, the elo. But if even within 50 amma he cannot see the shovach, he will not be medada, lo medada. And the reason for that is because the zavis of the house, so like there's a coop on this side, another coop on that side, and the house juts out and forms a barrier between the two coops. And therefore, the gozlim that he finds are mutarim. That's the big chiddush of the Mishnah, that even though there's another can within 50 amma, we don't assume that the birds that he finds here are not the ones that he designated, but rather they belong to the other can, which is within 50 amma, they were medadedim, because in this case, we don't apply the rule of toch hamishim amma medadedim. That's because of the Keren zone. The Mishnah says, Beit Shammai omrim ein notlin es ha'ali. So now we're going on to discuss a division, a controversy regarding Simchas Yontif and Muktzah on Yontif. And we have something called an Eli. The Eli is described as an eitz aveh v'kaved. It's a flat piece of very thick and heavy wood, and it's used for kochim imo chitim b'machteshes. So what they do is they use this kli, which is called an eli, to do ktisha, to crush grains and make flour out of grains. And now on Yontif, he wants to take this eli, which is designated for a malacha asura called ktisha, and he wants to use it lekatzev olav basar. He wants to use it as a cutting board for his meat. And this is a case of a kli shemalachto le'isur, a utensil that is designated for isur, namely kedisha, but he wants to use it l'tzarech gufo for something that's mutter to slice his meat. And Beit Shammai says it's a kli shemalachto le'isur, we're not allowed to be metaltal. Beis Hillel matirim. And one of two possibilities, either Beis Hillel matirim, because you're allowed to move a kli shemalachto le'isur l'tzarech gufo, and that's exactly what he's doing here. Or alternatively, Beis Hillel is going to introduce the matir of Simchas Yod. Now the Mishnah continues and presents a second machlokas between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beit Shammai omrim ein nosnin es ha'or lifnei adorsan v'lo yagbihenu elim kein yeshimo kezayis basa Beis Hillel matir. Beit Shammai have a twofold Easter here. Number one, let's say he shechts an animal on Yontif, and he skins the hide, and it needs a process called ibud, a tanning process. And now he wants to take this hide, flatten it on the ground in such a way that everybody who passes by will be dores, will stomp on the hide and do his work for him, the ibud. Beit Shammai prohibit that. Not only that, Beit Shammai say that the or itself, if it hasn't been tanned yet, in its raw state is mukta machmas kufo. It's like roros, avonim, and other afar, dirt, branches or wood. Well, wood is not a good example because we're dealing with yontif, but certainly avonim and afar, sroros, and the like, these are muktzah machmas gufo. They have no function. They're not a kli, they're not an ochel, they are muktzah, the real muktzah. This is a muktzah that even Rav Shimon agrees to. And Beit Shammai say that the status of the or is such that it has no function. It's like eitzim avonim. It's muktzah machmas gufo, unless there's a kezayis basar that's attached to the or, and then we apply the principle of agaf, that since the basar is not muktzah, the or to which the basar is attached is nigrar, is also not muktzah. And that's called agam. Beis Hillel matir, twofold machlokas here in the Sefer. Beis Hillel matir, number one, setting up, stretching out the or in a place on the ground where people will be dores. He's not worried about ma'abed. And number two, the or itself is not muktzah. And you're allowed to move it even if there's no kezayis basar attached to it. And once again, either Beis Hillel or matir mikra din, or there's a separate matir of simchas yod. The Gemara says, Tana, we learned in the Bryce, bishavim, meaning both Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai agree, shem kitzev olav basar, even according to Beis Hillel, although you're allowed to take this eli, and for tzarchei yontif, we're going to permit you to use it as a cutting board, but only as long as you're cutting or you foresee in the future cutting the meat on this cutting board. But im kvar kitzev, if already he implemented what he needed and cut the meat for yontif use, also letaltala, he can no longer move this cutting board because there's no simchas yontif involved, and he's not moving it l'tzarech gufo, and therefore it has the status of kli shemalachto le'isur. Amar Abaye, machlokes bi eli avol betabra garme divrei kolos mutter. Where does Beit Shammai disagree with Beis Hillel? They're more machmir. That's only in a case of an eli, which is a kli shemalachto le'isur. It's designated for kedisha, as we said before. But we have another kli, which is called tabra garmei, a kind of a chopping board. It's designated as such to chop up the bones and cut up the meat. Is even Beit Shammai would agree that's mutal taltala. So the Gemara asks Pshita, Eli Tanan. I mean, why would we think beyond Eli? Eli is a klisha malachali, so it's usually designated for Ketisha. But Tavra Garmei is not a klisha malachali, so it's designated for cutting meat, which is mutar yad. So for sure it's not mukta. Why do I need Abayis Chidish over here? Mao, the Gemara answers, Hu hadin dafilu tabara garmei nami. The Mishnah would prohibit, according to Beit Shammai, even tabara garmei, and this despite the fact that it's a klisha malachal lahet, we use it for cutting up meat. And the reason is because Beit Shammai are worried that maybe after he moves this kli, which you're telling him he's allowed to, he will have a change of heart and he will decide that he's not using the kli to cut up his meat and his bones. And therefore, it was a tiltul shalol tzarich yontif. You'll ask for hi diktoni eli. You had the diuk, it said eli. Mashma that tabara garmei. Everybody would agree is mutter. No. Lo diacha kochan Beis Hillel. Not only does Beis Hillel allow you, in the case of an eli. I'm sorry. Not only does Beis Hillel allow you, in the case of a tabara garmei, which is a klisha malachal leheter for chituch basar v'atzamos, but afilu davar shemalachal iser, even in the case of an eli, which is normally designated for ketisha, nami shari, Beis Hillel will allow. Again, why? Either because it's tzarich gufo or because it's tzarich yontiv. Amash malon. That's what Rabbi wants to tell me, that this is not the case. But in truth, even Beit Shammai concede that it's mutter to be metaltel a tabara garmei because it's a klisha malachal lehet. Ika diamri. Now we have another tradition as to the transmission of Abaye. Amar Abaye lo nitzracha. I didn't have to mention to you that tabara garmei is mutter. Ella, I wanted to be machadish to you, afilu tabara garmei chadete. The word chadete means new. Now, when you have a kli and it's brand new, it's very fragile. Later on, it gets tough. That's called siruf. It gets solid. Malditem, I would have thought, since it's brand new, he may realize a change of heart. It's not kedai in this very vulnerable state to use it to chop up bones and meat. You may break the kli entirely. Ashmalon, that's what Abai wants to tell me. We're not afraid of such a thing. And there's a heter tiltul, even in the case of tabara garmei chadete. Now, in both interpretations of Abaye, we conclude that Beit Shammai would not aser in a situation where there's no chashash shema yimloch. The reason for Beit Shammai is always because he may change his heart. So the Gemara raises the following objection to Abaye. Hu Beit Shammai lo chayesh limluche? Are you telling me that in the case of tabara garmei, and it's a brand new one, Beit Shammai, according to Abaye, are not worried that he might change his mind? For Tanya, I'll prove to you that Beit Shammai waves a flag of Shema Yimloch, of maybe he'll change his mind. Ein molichim tabach v'sakin eitzel behema, v'lo behema eitzel tabach v'sakin. If the butcher and the animal that he's meant to shech are far from each other, then we don't bring one to the other, not the sakin to the tabach and not the behema to the tabach. I should say not the tabach to the behema and not the behema to the tabach, or the sakin. And why is this prohibited? Beit Shammai prohibits it because he may change his mind and decide he doesn't want to shech the animal. And then all this tircha of transporting the sakin or the behema was for naught. So you see the Beit Shammai clearly are afraid of Chema Yimlo. And logically, therefore, the Gemara thinks by analogy we should apply to Tabora Garmei Chadet. Beisil Omrim Molichim Zeitzel Zeh. Beit Shammai Omrim Ein Molichin Tavlin Umadoch. This is like a smaller version of the Eli, which they use normally for Katisha. And now he wants to use it to transport Tavlin, spices, Eitzel Medocha. Below Medocha Eitzel Tavlin Umadoch. Again, he's schlepping this big, heavy machine, so to speak, because he wants to, and he intends to do a Katisha, or what we call Shchikas Tavlinim on Yontiv. And now we're letting him do all this tircha, so Beit Shammai say, you know what, I'm not going to allow it. Maybe he'll change his mind. But in any event, the bottom line is we see the Beit Shammai, a Choshe Shema Yimlo. And therefore they prohibit tircha on Yontiv for this very reason. So why shouldn't we apply that in the case of Tabora Garmei Chadete? Our answer is Hachi Hashta. There's a fundamental difference. I'll tell you why we have a real serious chashash according to Beit Shammai that he may defer and decide not to shech the animal. The Omar Nishbach, leave this one out. Hi behema kchusha. This animal is lean. My sino behema chriti dishmeina. Let me find a fatter animal that's more appropriate, more meaty, and I'm going to shech the other one. So that's why Beit Shammai are afraid of limloch. The same thing applies in the case of a kedera, where he takes the tavlin to the medocha for purposes of cooking. Nami asilim luche. Once again, says Beit Shammai, there's a good chance that he'll change his mind after he brings the tavlin into the medocha. The Omer will say, Nishbach, leave this one alone. Hi kedera de boy tavlin. This kedera needs spice. Maybe I won't have access to the right measurements of spice, and spicing is always complicated. My sina achrina de lobai tavlin. Maybe I'll find an alternative tavshil like basar ubitzolim, and they don't need tavlin. Now, in the case of kruv velefes, I'm sorry. So let's start again. Basar and bitzalim need tavlin. But I might find kruv velechles as a substitute, and they don't need tavlin. So at the end of the day, he's not going to be kodesh his batzal and basar, and then his whole tircha is shalol itzar. But hacha, in the case of tavra garmei, Michael Mema, he already shechted the animal. Mivlich v'lo tavar, he's in a very difficult position. What are you afraid of? He's going to change his mind. He's not going to break the bones and cut up the meat. Kevin deshchata litvira kaime. They are now designated to be broken and cut up. If you don't cut them up, then what are you going to do with them? I mean, you just shechted the animal. It's going to go to waste. And therefore, Beit Shammai are matir tiltur. We learned to that Mishnah Beit Shammai Omer ein nosnin es ha'or. We don't put the natural hide in front of the darsan, because that's called ibut. And Beisil Amati, Tana, we learned to the Bryce of Vishavim, Beis Shammai concede, Shemolichim olav basal itzli. Molchim olav basal itzli. Molicha means you take a piece of meat and you salt it, more often than not, to remove the dam. But in the case of in the case of basar, if you're designating the basar for tzli, then roast on an open fire. If you've ever seen a spit, a barbecue, it draws the blood, and therefore you only need a very minimal amount of salt for tzli. And in this case, even though the salt is going to fall on top of the R, and it will be beneficial for ibud, because that's how we do ibud on R, we salt it. But nevertheless, it's such a small amount that we don't have to worry about it. That's not real ibud. Maybe it'll have some positive effect on a scale from 0 to 100. Maybe it's worth 15, 20, 25, but it's not real, genuine, full-fledged ibud. Amar Abai lo shanu, this din that you're allowed to be molich basar on top of the R for the purpose of tzli, ella litzli, aval likdera lo. If he's doing molich on basar, which is designated for cooking, in other words, he's going to cook the meat rather than roast it, then he's going to need an awful lot of salt. Lo, we're not going to allow you to do the malicha on top of the R, because that malicha, that salt in its volume, is going to cause a full-fledged ibud on the R. The Gemara asks Shita. After all, it's Tzli Tanan. Let's read the Beitza. The Beitza says you're allowed to be molech tzli for the purpose of tzli. Right? It says molchin olav basal tzli. Why would I need a Abai to tell me, but not for kedera, not for bitchel? And the Gemara answers, "Hakamashwan dafilu tzli kein kedera asur." There's a midway between tzli on the one hand and kedera or bishul on the other hand, and that's a case of tzli kedar, which means that he salts it very, very well, almost as well as malichas basa, with a great volume of salt. And therefore, Abai wants to tell me, don't misunderstand that every tzli, whenever he's doing malich for tzli, is allowed to do this ibud process. That's not so. A classic tzli, but if it's tzli kedar, then it has the same status as bishul, a tavshil, and it also uses a major volume of salt. The man shechted an animal on Yontif, and the chalev, which is not edible, it's prohibited, he wants to process it in a way that it won't get ruined. If it gets ruined, it starts smelling very badly, has a foul odor. So what does he want to do? He wants to salt the chalev to prevent sirachon. Alternatively, you're not allowed to take the chalev and turn it upside down and right side up in order that the avir, to air it out. And this is even a case where he shechted it on Yontif itself. And this is not considered l'tzarech Yontif, it's a tircha yisera, because he's not eating the chalev. However, Mishum Rav Yeshua Amru, Shodchan beruach al gabi yisedos. What we're allowed to do is stretch out the chalev by holding it or placing it on top of vertical pegs so that the air will come and air it out upside down, inside out, to the bottom, the top, and prevent sirachon so it doesn't smell poorly. Omer of Masna aloch Rav Yeshua. Ike diami Omer of Masna ein aloch Rav Yeshua. Gemara says, what's the chiddush here of Rav Masna? Bishlem, I understand. Lamandi Omer aloch Rav Yeshua. If we have that transmission, it's Salka dait kamina yochid v'ram aloch karabim, we should pass like the Chachamim against Rav Yeshua. Kamash Malon, that's where Rav Masna is macharish to us, that in this particular case, halacha ki yochid, and the reason for that is because the svara, the logic, compels us towards the position of Rabbi Yeshua. But El Amanti Omer She'ein halacha Rabbi Yeshua, if the proper transmission of Rav Masna was that we don't pass Rabbi Yeshua pshita yochid ram halacha karamin, what exactly is the chiddush here of Rabbi Yeshua? We always pass like the Rabbin. How did I would have thought Mistabra time made Rabbi Yeshua. The logic of Rabbi Yeshua to be matir in the case where he stretches it out is very compelling. And the reason for that is the ilo sharisle, if you're not giving him some option, some alternative to air out the chelev and prevent sirachon, nimna v'lo shochet. He's not going to shech the animal and then end up with chalavim that smell poorly. Kamash malon. So Rav Masna tells us, no, we're not going to accept the logic of Rabbi Yeshua, but rather we pass him like the Chacham. Let's go back and review the last point. And we're trying to find a chiddush in Rav Masna's statement, according to that girsa, that ain't halachic Rabbi Yeshua. What's the chiddush? And the answer is Ma'od Tema, Mistaber Taima de Rabbi Yeshua, the lo sharis le'mimna v'lo shachit kamash bolon. The Gemara asks, Umayshna, how is this din of shticha of the chalavim al gabi yisedos that we would not be materit, but rather we paskin like the chachamim? How's it different than the or lifnei adarsan that Beis Hillel were matir? In both cases, we're stretching something out. Either we're stretching out the chalavim or we're stretching out the or. And in the case of or lifnei adarsan, Beis Hillel were materit. Why don't we say that in the case of shtichas chalavim, the logic of Rabbi Yeshua should be compelling, and if we don't allow it, then yimona, he'll be prevented from shchita and from simchas yontif, and that's in fact the logic behind Beis Hillel, and we accept Beis Hillel in the case of shtichas or lifnei adarsan. And here we turn to Amud Beis. Hasam, there in the case of R, lo mucha milsa, demishum dechazi lemizgale. It's not absolutely clear that he's stretching out the R for the purpose of ibud, because maybe he's doing it because he wants to sit on it. And in those days, when they sat on the ground, they liked to stretch some sort of a hide, like a mat, on the ground. So the owner of the R, when they tell him, and he finds out that the Chacham were matir, Beis Hillel was matir with tzorech yontif, to stretch out the R, he thinks in his mind it's not for the purpose of ibud, it's the purpose of sitting, which is so common. But in the case of chalavim, asi lemeimar, for matir to him, he's going to come to the mistaken conclusion, my time at shari l'rabbanu, why do they allow it for me? Ki hechi d'lo lisrach, so that it shouldn't smell bad. Because there's no other purpose, like in the case of R, there was a secondary purpose besides ibud lemizga alei. Here, in the case of chelev, what other purpose is there? Other than stretching it and airing it out so it shouldn't smell. Is therefore he's going to say to himself, Mali mishtachinu, Mali lemim lechinu. What's the difference between stretching it out and salting it? Once they were matir, stretching it out and airing it, then I'm allowed to add salt to it. And when you add salt to chelev, that's called ibud. Then he violates one of the malachas d'oraisa listed in the 39 malachas, and that's meleches ibud. Therefore, even though they were matir, shtichas or, in order not so as not to inhibit him about simchas yontif, but they were not matir for the same reason, which toches achalavim, where he might come possibly to violate one of the malachos, namely meleches ibud. Finally, just to get to the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Meshmuel molech adam kama chatichos basa bevasachas afal pishenu tzarich el chaticha achas. We allow you, once we allow you to do malach l'tzorch ochel nefesh, if there's no extra tircha, we're going to allow you to add a volume even though he's not going to eat it during the course of the day. Normally, you're not allowed to prepare from Yontif to Chol, but once you're doing the malacha, there's no extra tircha. We allow it. And this is comparable to cases which we'll have later on in the Sechta, where a woman puts extra basar into the pot, even though she only intends to use part of it. Or let's say you have chibur mayim and you add water and so forth. Many, many cases that fit into this category of Adu Baracha, Barava Marim. He used to organize this subterfuge, so to speak, Umolach Garma Garma. He would salt one etzem at a time, and every time he salted a chaticha, he would say, you know what? There's a better chaticha. Let me salt another chaticha. Notel chaticha cheres v'omer chi'areva lo lechlayom yosef ben hakodeves umolcha. And this is what he did with many different chatichos, one after the other. So this leads us here to the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph Amid